actually a $70 billion, which is actually a $70 billion issue in America, is slips and falls, and he's had national leadership on that. And as you can see from his hat, he's also a veteran in the United States Navy. So yeah, he asked me to read this today because his voice is simply not too strong. He's still not quite into Zoom yet, so he wants to know how this goes. I'm going to go ahead and get started. So as I read, just please picture that it's Dennis's voice coming out in these words. Okay, before I get into my adventures, I want to talk to you a little bit about my photography background, how I got into wedding photography, and what it's like to be a wedding photographer. I always enjoyed showing people the pictures I took of their wedding, but I never really enjoyed taking the pictures. It's a very tough job, and you have to get it right the first time, every time. You can never go back and shoot the weddings again. If you have a photography hobby, people will assume that you would do a good job taking their wedding pictures. I don't care how good a photographer you are, the only way you can learn to photograph weddings is to actually photograph weddings. Lots and lots of weddings. I was an award-winning photographer before I shot my first wedding. I was the yearbook photographer and worked in a photography studio when I was in high school. I was a photographer's mate in the Navy. I won several photo contests and had 2 photos selected for book covers. I even went door to door taking baby pictures. I was asked several times to shoot a friend's wedding, and I always said no. I had no idea how to shoot a wedding. I even turned down my pastor and my boss. My boss said, "You do not understand. I am your boss. You must take these wedding photos." And I said, "You do not understand. I do not take wedding pictures." To explain why, I told him the story of Donald Yeager. When I was in high school, my older brother's best friend was Donald Yeager. He owned a photography studio in my hometown. Donald was a really tough guy. I remember one time he actually killed a bear with his hunting knife, and another time I saw him pour alcohol on a big open cut on his arm, and he never even flinched. So I was shocked one day when I went into his studio and saw him sitting at his desk sobbing. I asked him what was wrong. He explained that he'd just developed his negatives from a big, B-I-G wedding of the richest family in town, and the pictures did not turn out. The flash bulb fired. This was in the 1950s, and they used flash bulbs back then, but the camera's flash synchronization switch failed, and the pictures had no light. Of course, there was no way to have them do the wedding all over again. He was absolutely devastated. He asked me to promise him that I would never photograph a wedding so I could avoid this ever happening to me. I agreed to never, ever photograph a wedding. However, many years later, we had close friends who asked me to shoot their daughter's wedding. I told them the Donald Yeager story. They said they just wanted snapshots taken and said they did not even care if the pictures turned out. There was a best man and a maid of honor, but no one else but the bride and groom in the wedding party. And I agreed to do it. Donald Yeager must have been spinning in his grave. Everything went fine, and soon other friends asked me to photograph their weddings. Around this time, my wife was making wedding cakes for friends and decided to start a wedding cake business. She suggested I start offering to take wedding photos to supplement. She suggested I started offering to take wedding photos to supplement her wedding cake business. I would start with small, informal weddings, charging only the cost of my materials plus $50, with the understanding that I was just getting experience. I got library books about wedding photography. They all were aimed at professional wedding photographers, and they involved using lots of very expensive professional equipment. They weren't much help for me. The most difficult thing I had to learn was, what pictures do I take and how do I pose the people? I had to become skilled with this and very comfortable with doing it. Imagine, the wedding party is ready to have their formal posed pictures taken. They are all together. You have the bride, the groom, the best man, the maid of honor, multiple groomsmen. I once had 10 of these. Multiple maids. I also had 10 of these. Flower girl and ring bearer. The bride's parents, the groom's parents, step parents. And they ask you, what do you want us to do? What groupings do you do and how do you pose them? Learning how to shoot a wedding is a lot like learning how to swim or how to ride a bicycle. You can't learn how to do them from reading books. You have to do them in order to learn how to do them. The name of our business was Affordable Weddings. We ran an ad in the Yellow Pages, but later most of our bookings came from referrals. People liked our work. I told people that if they wanted the highest quality pictures with big enlargements and great creativity based on years of professional experience, they should stick with the professionals because they were the best. They had to charge more because they had to pay all of their living expenses, plus studio rent, etc., out of the fees they charged. But if you just wanted simple pictures that looked good and told the story of the wedding, and you were on a budget, you may want to choose me. I had lots of samples of my work to show them, and I knew how to take wedding pictures. I also had a good paying full-time job. I only did wedding photography on Saturdays to supplement my income. People are usually happy at weddings, but not always. Sometimes emotions get the best of them and they get short-tempered or very emotional and become very difficult to deal with. A wedding photographer has to be prepared for this and know how to deal with it when it happens. No matter how difficult people become, you have to remain cool and pleasant and not let anything bother you. I will have a few examples to share with you about this. Shooting weddings puts the photographer under a lot of pressure. You only have one chance to get everything right. You can't go back and reshoot the wedding. Remember Donald Yeager? Kind of like Remember the Alamo. Things go wrong at weddings. A good wedding photographer is always prepared for things to go wrong. I will have lots of examples to share with all of you about this. I had duplicate equipment for everything I used, even tripods. I learned the hard way to always be prepared for an unexpected equipment failure. I photographed all my weddings with film. There were no digital cameras when I photographed weddings. There is a world of difference between photographing a wedding with film and doing it with a digital camera. First of all, with a digital camera, you can review the pictures immediately after taking them. You can check to see if eyes are closed or if the lighting is correct, or most important of all, if the camera actually took the picture. You don't have to reload film. You don't have to send film to a lab and wait for the pictures to come back and see how they turned out. Retouching can easily be done with digital photography and digital editing. You don't have to store all of those negatives. You can store the pictures in a digital files on your computer or on the cloud. You can also easily print your own enlargements without using a professional lab. Okay, so enough of that. Let's get to my adventures. One of my first weddings was at Red Rock Christian Church in Boise. It was at the old building before it burned down and was replaced with a modern building with air conditioning. It was a very hot day and everyone was sweating and anxious to get to the reception. Since I was very new at this, I was taking a lot of time struggling with the poses. People were asking me if I could work faster. I finally got through the first roll of 36 exposure 35T film. I rewound the film until I realized that the camera was not actually rewinding the film because there was no film in the camera. I can't even begin to describe what I felt like at that moment. I was the only one there. Sorry, let me let someone in. I was the only one there that realized that all those pictures that I had taken were not taken at all. I immediately thought of the promise I had made to Donald Yeager. I told the bride and groom I had to speak with them privately. I had good news and I had bad news. The good news was that their wedding pictures were free, including the album and enlargements. The bad news was that there were no wedding pictures. There was no film in the camera. We had to do them all over. However, since everyone knew what to do, I would be able to do them much faster. We did that and everything turned out well, especially the part about free wedding pictures and a free album. A few years later, I photographed a large family reunion at the Basque Center. People flew in from all over the country. There were over 100 people there, and I had to take pictures of each family group. I also had to photograph 2 weddings the next day. It turned out that halfway through the family reunion pictures, the flash synchronization switch on my camera got bumped, and the same thing happened to me that happened to Donald Yeager. Half of the family reunion pictures turned out and the rest didn't. None of the wedding pictures turned out for both weddings. This was probably the biggest disaster of my entire lifetime. I was definitely ready to quit the wedding photography business. Instead, I sold both of my cameras with the flash synchronization switch and bought new cameras that did not have the switch. They no longer make flash synchronization switches on cameras as they are only necessary if you are using flash bulbs. I only ever had one other equipment failure. When the bride and groom were coming down the aisle after they were pronounced husband and wife, the flash failed because the flash batteries chose that exact moment to die. I solved the problem by cropping the picture so you could not see the people in the aisles. It just looks like a close-up photo. Catholic weddings are pretty much all the same, but Protestant weddings vary greatly. At a Protestant wedding rehearsal, the pastor asked the bride and groom if they wanted formal or informal vows. They said they wanted very informal vows. He said, "Okay, how about this? I, Paul, take you, Diana, for as long as it's convenient and you don't cramp my space." They agreed that was a little bit too informal. I always talked to the pastor before the wedding to assure him or her that I would not get in their way. One pastor told me that one photographer actually rested his camera on his shoulder as he was giving the bride and groom their vows. Dennis did not do that. The Cathedral of the Rockies in Boise has a very long aisle. They also have a lot of marble steps going up to the altar. One time, a bride's half slip fell around her ankles as she started down the aisle. Her long train hid this from view, so she scooted along and was even able to get up the steps to the altar, back down the steps, and back up the aisle without anyone knowing that her slip was around her ankles the entire time during the ceremony. The wedding coordinator at the Cathedral of the Rockies was very strict. The photographer was not allowed in the sanctuary while the wedding was being performed. I used to go up on the balcony to watch the weddings. One time I was up there and I had a medical emergency and I had to call a fellow wedding photographer to come to the church to finish taking the pictures. Luckily, he lived nearby and was able to do it. One of the first things I did when I started out was to make a list of poses so that they could choose the poses that they wanted. I would charge extra for additional groups of people to be photographed. This turned out to be a bad idea. When I was taking the formal wedding pictures after the wedding, a man and woman came up to me and explained that the bride was their favorite granddaughter, and they had driven all the way from Arizona to attend the wedding. They wanted to know if they could have their picture taken with the bride and groom. I told them they would have to ask the bride and groom's permission. The bride said, right in front of her grandparents, "No, we don't need that picture." The grandparents put their heads down and returned to their seats. I never again charged extra for additional poses, and I never again turned anyone away that wanted to have their picture taken. I also added grandparents to the pose list. Divorced parents often won't allow themselves to be photographed together. You would not believe how many times a bride or a groom pleaded with their parents to take a photograph together, with both parents refusing to do so. Once, a divorced father of the bride flew in from out of town for the wedding. He was wearing a rented tuxedo. I heard the pastor ask the bride if she had told her father yet that she did not want him to walk her down the aisle. She waited until he was beside her when the wedding march music started. She then told him she was going to walk down the aisle by herself, and she did. As a photographer, you can't allow yourself to be offended by bad behavior by the bride or groom. I once had a groom who was a real jerk. When I took the first picture of the newly married couple, I asked them to smile. He said, "Just shut up and take the damn picture." I always focused my camera and attention on the bride if she was in the picture. You can't really see two people at the same time, and expressions can change in the blink of an eye. When the proofs came back, he stayed in the car and didn't even come in to look at them. She said, "You got some really great pictures of me, but not many good ones of my husband." I told her a camera takes pictures of what it sees. She replied, "Well, he does look like that most of the time." Once, after shooting pictures of the father of the bride with the bride and groom, the bride's father told me he was divorced and he was getting remarried to another man. He wanted to know if I would take the pictures. I envisioned a wedding cake with 2 grooms on it, and I never got a call from him to book that wedding. My strangest request came when I got a call asking me if I'd be willing to photograph a nudist wedding. I told the groom that I would be willing to do it, but only if I could wear clothes. He said he would find someone else to do it. I once had a wedding where the best man was a dog, an Irish setter. He really was the groom's best friend. He wore a tux and had a ribbon around his neck with the wedding ring tied to it, and he sat perfectly still throughout the wedding. On a hot summer day, I did a wedding at the small BSU chapel on Broadway Avenue. The bride was ready to go in a travel van parked outside. There was no air conditioning in the chapel. The pastor was more than a half an hour late. The temperature was almost 100 degrees outside and was stifling in the chapel. No one knew if the pastor was ever going to show up. And this was back in the early 1980s where no one had cell phones. No one answered his home phone. He had the time wrong for the wedding. When he showed up, he thought he was early. When he realized what had happened, he was very shaken. When he pronounced the couple as husband and wife, he presented them to the guests as Mr. and Mrs. wrong names. At a church in Meridian, the pianist did not show up. Finally, the guests just hummed the wedding march as the bride came down the aisle. At a small church in Boise, there were heavy drapes behind the candelabras. When the candles were all lighted, one of the candelabras fell against the drapes and set them on fire. At that same church, the ring bearer at the wedding was a very active child, and he was holding the cushion with a ribbon on it. that tied the rings into place. One was tied so tightly that the best man took several minutes to untie the knot at the altar. When the knot finally came loose, the pastor pointed his finger at the groom and said, "And we are going to tie this knot just as tightly as that one." The flower girl at one wedding suddenly shouted, "Mommy, I'm going to throw up." Her mother rushed up to the altar, dashed to the restroom with her daughter, and saved the day. At another wedding, the groom had been previously married and had a 5-year-old son who was the ring bearer. When the pastor said, "We are gathered here today to join this couple in marriage," the boy suddenly grabbed his father's leg and shouted, "Daddy, no, no, please, please, no, don't." At one wedding, the groom, as he was about to say his vows, suddenly fainted and fell to the floor. One time, when I was ready to take the before wedding formal pictures, the bride locked herself in the bathroom and refused to come out. She said she did not want her picture taken. Another bride, as I was about to take the formal pictures, suddenly started to cry uncontrollably. She could not stop and finally told me to go ahead and take the pictures, which I did. At a very large wedding at the Cathedral of the Rockies, the flower delivery, including the bride's bouquet, was very late and actually delayed the wedding. When the florist finally got there, he only had the flowers for the wrong wedding. I shot a wedding at the old St. Mark's Catholic Church on Northview in Boise. They had the reception in the gym. The guys got dressed there and had a keg in the gym for the reception. The groom used the keg several times to get relaxed before the wedding. His nose got as bright as Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer, and it showed up that way in the pictures, and there was nothing we could do to fix it. I once had a wedding at a large church where they had accidentally scheduled 2 weddings only 30 minutes apart. Both were very large weddings. It was a bit chaotic, especially when both photographers had to take formal pictures both before and after the wedding, as the groom is not supposed to see the bride in her wedding dress until she comes down the aisle. Also, a lot of people came early for the second wedding, but we somehow managed to work things out. One of the pictures on my pose list was a photo of the bride getting ready. I would always ask the maid of honor to call me when the bride was ready for me to take the picture. Usually, it was a photo of the maid of honor putting on the bride's hat and veil. Once, when I arrived, the bride was sitting in her dressing table in her underwear. She said, "What do you want me to do?" And I said, "Smile." And I took the picture. Her husband was very upset when he saw the proofs. She said, "What's the problem? It's no different than when I wear a 2-piece bathing suit." The husband did not agree. Once, when I was led into the dressing room, one of the bridesmaids was completely naked. She shouted, "What's he doing in here?" And the bride said, "It's okay, he's seen lots of naked women before." When I first started taking wedding pictures, I had several outdoor weddings. These can be a problem. When you book the wedding, you never know if it's going to rain that day. If there's a bright sun, people are either in the sun or in the shade or both. If people face the sun, they squint their eyes. If the sun is at their back, the camera is taking a picture directly into the sun. It can also get very windy. I once had a wind so strong that it blew the arch over where the bride and groom stood to be married. One of my first weddings, the groom was chewing tobacco during the ceremony and spitting tobacco juice onto the grass during the ceremony, and also when coming down the aisle after the ceremony. Finally, I decided no more outdoor weddings. Indoor weddings only. I preferred churches that had steps going up to the altar. It was also easier to pose groups on steps. At one wedding, the bride had a big bow on the back of her wedding gown. She was very nervous and kept having to go to the bathroom. Just before the wedding, her bow came off and fell into the toilet. She and the bridesmaids frantically used hair dryers to dry the bow out. One bride asked my wife to make her wedding cake with a pudding filling. My wife had never done this before, but agreed to do it. On the way to the wedding, I had to make a sudden stop, and the cake slid and toppled over. It was a mess, and the bride was not amused. It was not our fault, but we still did not charge for the cake. My wife never made another cake with filling. My wife always brought extra cake columns of different sizes to each wedding, even if she did not do the cake. Sometimes when friends made the wedding cake, cakes would end up being lopsided or would, for other reasons, have to be fixed. My wife would take care of it. Once a person used an upside down champagne glass as columns, and that did not work out very well. My wife came to the rescue and fixed it. At one of the weddings, the bride's name was Amy. A wedding singer was hired to suddenly appear as a surprise and present the bride with a rose while singing "Once in Love with Amy." It was a bigger surprise than the parents expected. The singer turned out to be an old boyfriend that Amy had broken up with, and he was as surprised as she was. A bride once called and said she had a change to make for the wedding. Everything was the same, the date, the time, the place, etc., except for the name of the groom. She decided to marry a different guy. One couple decided to wait a year before looking at the proofs of their wedding pictures. And yes, 1 year later, they were still married. Another couple had a disagreement as to the kind of wedding they wanted to have. It was her dream to have a large formal wedding and to wear an elaborate wedding gown with a long train. He was an Idaho country boy and wanted to have a very informal wedding. They ended up with her wearing her beautiful wedding gown, and he wore Levi's, cowboy boots, and a Western shirt with a rose stuck in his pocket. And they both had a great time. At the reception of the same wedding, when it was time to call up the unmarried men for the garter toss, the groom shouted out, "Charlie, your marriage is in trouble. Come on up here." Speaking of the garter toss, I shot a wedding where the bride was extremely bashful and shy, and she dreaded even the idea of sitting in a chair in front of all the people while her new husband took her garter off. It was a dreadful shock and surprise to her that when the time came, he reached up under her gown with a pair of panties rolled up and hidden in his clenched fists. He pulled his hand out and then stood up and shook out the panties for all to see. As the crowd roared, I think she probably wanted to kill him. Even I wanted to kill him. At one wedding, the pastor's daughter was the bride. He was so nervous that he forgot the words to the Lord's Prayer. The groomsmen once wrote, "Help me," on the soles of the groom's shoes so it would show up when he knelt at the altar. A terrible thing happened at a wedding when, on the wedding night, the groom brutally beat up his wife. She had to be hospitalized. The wedding was annulled. However, her parents still wanted the wedding pictures because she looked so beautiful in her wedding gown, and they cut out the groom in all of the pictures. I had one wedding where the reception was held at the bride's parents' home. The parents got into a fight with the groom and threw him out of the house and told him to never return. The marriage was over. When I first started to shoot weddings, people threw rice when the bride and groom came down the church steps after the wedding. They later changed to bird seed to avoid cleanup and to help the birds. I remember a comedian once said that if the bride is pregnant, they should throw puffed rice. The bride was pregnant at the very first wedding I ever shot. Years later, her baby became the bride at one of the last weddings I ever photographed. Speaking of pregnant brides, how the heck do you take formal pictures of a very pregnant bride and avoid showing the baby bump? For one thing, you never take a photo from the side. You always have them stand straight on to the camera. The other thing I did was to have them lower the bouquet a bit to cover the bump. A lot of brides may have been pregnant at my weddings, but you would never know it by looking at their formal wedding pictures. I once had a wedding where I think the priest had a few sips of sacramental wine to get ready for the wedding. He kept asking me if I got the picture all through the wedding. He would loudly say, "Photographer, is your camera in focus?" Or, "Are you close enough?" Just after he pronounced them husband and wife, he asked me if I was ready to take a picture of the kiss. I tried to keep the mood light by saying funny things while shooting the photos. One priest said that he would not allow laughing during picture taking, and that the church was a holy place and that no laughing was allowed. And if it did not stop, he would send every one of us out and close the church. The maid of honor is usually the bride's best friend. One time, the maid of honor was very late for the wedding. Finally, a note from her was given to the bride. It explained that she would not be at the wedding because she was in love with the groom and could not stand to see him marry someone else.
Holy Toledo.
These are all true stories. The most tragic thing that ever happened at any wedding I ever did was when the maid of honor was killed in an auto accident on her way to the reception after the wedding. I usually go to the receptions after the weddings. Fortunately for me, this was one where they did not want any pictures taken at the reception. I did not find out what happened until the bride and groom looked at their proofs. My all-time favorite wedding story involves the lighting of the unity candle. Right after the bride and groom together lit the candle, the flame burned brightly. As the pastor told the guests, this flame represents the eternal love that each one has for the other. At that precise moment, the flame went out. A loud gasp could be heard from the guests. The groom quickly grabbed the candle lighter and relit the candle to the applause and cheers of everyone there, including me. A year later, we called them to ask how they were doing. We were curious to see if they were still married. They were. One of my last weddings, the reception was on an upper floor of a newly constructed high-rise motel. Several of us got there at the same time and got on the elevator together. One woman was afraid of elevators and claustrophobic, but got on anyway. And of course, the elevator got stuck between floors and she really, really panicked. And it seemed to take forever for them to get the elevator working so we could finally get out. Finally, as I neared retirement from my full-time job, my wife and I decided that it was time to retire from the wedding business. I photographed my last wedding, and my wife baked her last wedding cake more than 20 years ago. We were both definitely ready for retirement from the wedding business. We sold all our equipment so we would not be tempted to do it again. I got a lot of calls from the parents who I had shot weddings for that had another son or daughter that was getting married. One had 5 children. I had shot the weddings of all their other 4 children, and now number 5 was getting married. They were very upset when I told them I could not do it. Others were very upset as well. And my wife also had lots of calls to bake wedding cakes. I don't miss shooting weddings, and she does not miss making wedding cakes. We've enjoyed the time off. I never had a customer that was dissatisfied with their pictures. I always looked forward to showing them the proofs when they were ready. We are very proud of the work we did, and we are always happy to share our stories with our friends and with NKA members. I hope you all enjoyed my presentation. So there you go, this Dennis Fetzer's story, Adventures of a Wedding Photographer. I see Chris clapping. He's a photographer. He probably can relate to some of this, but yeah, all these stories are true. It's just amazing what he saw. It's amazing what you can see. Dennis, who is a professional photographer, said this really, thanks for that comment, laugh out loud funny. Yeah, like the stories he tells are, he said it's not about photography, it's about the stories of what happens at weddings. And he just wanted to share that with you because not many people get that insider's view for all those hundreds of weddings.
It'd make a great short story.
That's a good point. It would make a great short story. The way Dennis writes, it kind of just captivates you, and I hope you all were captivated by it.
It's written, it just needs a place to be published.
I'll have to tell Dennis that. He'll appreciate that. I kept saying, I don't know how I'm going to get through this without laughing because some of these are really funny. And as you saw the picture of Dennis, I'm just trying to imagine his reaction at some of these with all of his double equipment. So any questions people have or anything else?
I've really enjoyed the pandemic NKA meetings.
Well, that's good to hear, Chris. Moving forward, we'll probably do them both. We'll do them in person and also online, probably at the same time. So that's what people can look forward to. And for anyone wanting to know when that will happen, it looks like it might happen in the spring. So we'll keep you updated.
Very nice.
Okay, well, anything else?
No, you got it. Thank you. Thanks for
Okay.
this. This is great.
Yeah, well, thank you all, and you all enjoy this beautiful spring day.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.